Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to the Baker Institute at Rice University. It's my privilege to open up this session, which unfortunately is the last of a three-part series of panel discussions on the role of religion in politics and policy. When we launched this series, Dr. Martin walked in my office with this great idea over a year and a half ago. And I want to make it clear that this was before faith-based organizations was à la mode, that we came up with this panel. So we're not being trendy and picking something at the last minute. This is something that we decided over a year and a half ago. But in my experience in diplomacy, I learned, especially in the Middle East context, that the role of religion and culture is one of the most underestimated factors in policy formulation. And if we as Americans do not understand the role of religion and culture more profoundly, that our own foreign policy formulation is going to suffer because of that in all parts of the world. But most importantly, here at home, we have to understand what the role of religion and politics and policy are. And this is really the spirit under which we launch these series of lectures. The first one was Reflections on the Elections, the Role of Religion in the 2000 Elections. The second one was Religion in the Political Realm, What is the Appropriate Role? And tonight's session will be on faith-based organizations and the provision of social services. It's my pleasure to invite to the podium Professor William Martin, who is the Harry and Hazel Chavan Professor of Religion and Public Policy in the Department of Sociology at Rice University and a senior scholar at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. He is the author of With God on Our Side, The Rise of the Religious Right in America, which was the companion book in the 1996 PBS miniseries of the same name, which I'm sure many of you have seen. And he has written recently on the influence of religion on American foreign policy. I would also like to thank once again Harry Chavan for his tremendous support of the Baker Institute and of this specific series of lectures. So please join me in welcoming Professor Bill Martin to the podium.
Thank you, Ambassador Djeredjian, Mr. Chavan, and thank all of you for coming, and for a number of you I know have been here at all of these sessions. As Ambassador Djeredjian said, a year ago when we were planning this, we thought faith-based organizations would be important, but we didn't know just how timely it would turn out to be. The insertion of a charitable choice option in the 1996 Welfare Reform Bill opened the doors for increased cooperation between religion and government. Both Governor Bush and Vice President Gore pledged to increase governmental cooperation with faith-based organizations during their presidential campaigns. In his first concrete policy proposal of his presidential campaign, Governor Bush announced a massive expenditure of $8 billion to fund pervasively religious church-based social services. And in one of his early actions after becoming president, he established the new Office on Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. Now, it shouldn't come as any surprise that these initiatives have roiled the waters, drawing praise from some and fire from others, and with conservatives and liberals on both sides of the vote. I suspect that many of us are not quite certain where we stand on these issues. If work needs to be done and religious people are doing it, why not help them? But if we start giving taxpayers' money to religious groups, doesn't that violate the historic separation of church and state? Well, hasn't that separation been carried to an extreme never foreseen by the framers of the Constitution? Or, given the remarkable and ever-increasing diversity of religion in this country, doesn't separation of religion and government make more sense than ever? And if that's true, does that mean that separation of these realms is more important than helping people who are in need? So you see, You can multiply these questions and come up with a counter question for just about anything you think of. These aren't easy questions to deal with confident finality, or to answer with confident finality. But to help us sort through some of these issues, we're fortunate to have with us this evening 3 people who think about them all the time, and who, I think it's fair to say, see thinking about them as a sort of faith-based duty. As those of you who were here at other programs or have looked at the Baker website will recall, the Reverend Eugene Rivers was scheduled to be here this evening to talk about the work of the faith-based organization that he heads in Boston, and I'm very sorry that he's not able to be here. Due to some personnel changes in his office, in the scheduling office, something else got scheduled the same night as this got scheduled, and he decided that that one would take priority. He expressed his regrets, and I expressed our regrets, and we will carry on without him. Despite our disappointment, though, we don't have any shortage of experts, not with Marvin Olasky, Mark Palavin, and Sam Smoot on the dais. As your program notes, Marvin Olasky is a professor of journalism at the University of Texas in Austin, a senior fellow at the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, and editor of World, a national weekly that analyzes news from a biblical perspective. He's written 13 books of history and cultural analysis, and one of these, The Tragedy of American Compassion, published in 1992, is often given credit for having given rise to the concept of compassionate conservatism. In it, he notes that during the 19th century, thousands of local faith-based charitable agencies and churches around the country had waged a war on poverty that he judged to be more successful than the one waged in this country since the 1960s. He also argued that government needed to do more to help the poor, and that a crucial step in that direction would be to return to private, especially religious organizations, as major providers of social services. That book eventually got the attention of Bill Bennett and several other conservative leaders. Bill Bennett gave a copy to Newt Gingrich, and in due time, Marvin Olasky went to Washington to provide assistance to Republican legislators who were working on welfare reform. In Texas, it came to the attention of Governor George Bush, who adopted the ideas and the term compassionate conservatism as a key part of his governmental agenda and a signature slogan of his run for the presidency. A more recent book, published last year with the title Compassionate Conservatism, recounts Professor Olasky's visit, along with his teenage son Daniel, to a variety of faith-based organizations across the United States. In it, he talks about the achievements, the possibilities, and the pitfalls involved in partnerships between government and faith-based organizations. It's clearly the work of a caring man with a helping spirit. Because of his writings and his many speaking engagements and television appearances, Professor Olasky is sometimes referred to as the godfather of compassionate conservatism. He mentioned just before the program he prefers guru. But in recent weeks, he has gained attention for raising important questions about potential problems involved in government funding of faith-based initiatives. So in having this discussion this evening, we are privileged to go to the source of much of this. There's one other thing you need to know about Marvin Olasky. He is an avid baseball fan, as all good people should be, even though he may be more kindly disposed toward the Texas Rangers than the Houston Astros. In our early communication regarding this event, he expressed the hope that he might be able to combine his appearance this evening with a ball game at Enron Field. And if the game today had been an early afternoon game, I would have tried to arrange that, and as a dutiful host would have gone with him. But the game is, perhaps you know, started at 4:30. Does anyone know how that, well, forget it. In any case, since we couldn't attend the game, I'd like to celebrate the opening of the baseball season in Houston, as well as this program, by giving a fitting introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, batting first and playing faith-based, number 1, Marvin Olasky.
Wow, what a great introduction. I do thank you. Dr. Martin asked me, since I am batting leadoff, to try to, in a sense, take a few pitches to establish the tempo of the game, try to lay out a little bit of the history, give a kind of overview of how we have come to our present point. And so I have a little time machine tour for you with 10 short stops. No relation to baseball. But stop one, 1774. That's when the British made a lasting mark on James Madison and lots of other people by so firmly trying to maintain Anglicanism, the Church of England, as the established church in Virginia, that they actually slid whips down the throats of Baptist preachers. The establishment of religion was something which people in colonial times were very familiar with. The British tried to establish Anglicanism in any of the colonies where they could do so without provoking a huge uproar. And as the established denomination, the Church of England received official preference. It was the sole religious recipient of tax revenues taken from Anglicans and non-Anglicans alike. And people like James Madison and many others grew to hate what was then the corruption of Anglicanism at that particular time, but particularly its persecution of Baptists and other dissenters. Our second stop is 15 years later, 1789, when James Madison led the United States Congress to come to agreement on the 16 words that make up the section on religion of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That amendment, the 16 words of it, could be summarized really in 2 words: never again. The founders never again wanted to see what had prevailed in colonial days, where one religious viewpoint received preference. They wanted, to use today's terminology, and I guess I'm coming back to baseball again, a level playing field. Our third stop could be almost any point in the 19th or the first half of the 20th century. A theistic consensus existed in the United States. It gradually came to include Catholics and, all too slow, came to include Jews. That theistic consensus dominated the United States. It was seen as completely appropriate for Christians or Jews or anyone else with good manners to proselytize. And the word proselytize, by the way, originated with Jewish missionary efforts 1,800 years ago. And I mention good manners because force or bribes or badgering, like a player jawing at an umpire, any of that for purposes of trying to pressure people into conversion, that was seen as a remnant of Europe, out of place in a sweet land of religion and liberty. And government at this time sometimes got involved, as Dr. Martin mentioned, and the historical research I've done. I've pointed out how private groups, largely religious, carried on a very effective war on poverty under circumstances much more dire than any we face today. If you look at the crowding, the incredible crowding and the health problems and so forth that immigrants faced in the 1880s and 1890s and early 1900s in New York and Boston and other eastern cities, just a terrible situation. But the difference is that those immigrants were poor for a short time, and they came out of poverty, like my own grandparents in Boston, right before World War I. There were streams of fresh water flowing among the poor, not winter after winter after winter, always frozen, always winter, and in a sense, never Christmas. So government was largely uninvolved, but when it did become involved, it didn't see anything wrong with trying to help religious groups in ways that acknowledged their support within the community. For example, Chicago officials, when they had fines for prostitution, when they fined the brothels, they distributed that money to 2 refuges for unmarried pregnant women, one Protestant, one Catholic, those being the predominant populations in 1880 in Chicago. Our fourth stop is the 1960s, where instead of religion and liberty being seen as going together, religion, in a sense, providing a tether so that people would not float out to space. Instead of seeing that they go together, they came to be seen as opposed. And in our zeal to avoid any preference for religions or religion, we established a preference, secularism. Courts removed prayer from public schools, which had some pluses and some minuses. It's a mixed bag there. But social service programs, to think particularly about poverty fighting. Any social service program that included worship or prayer or evangelism or really any recognition of God became ineligible for government funds. And the result, in Richard John Newhouse's memorable phrase, was the naked public square. Not neutral, but naked. We often think of secularism as the neutral position. It's not. It's an important distinction. If two people stand before us, one wearing clothes and the other naked, we are unlikely to think of the naked person as having a neutral position regarding clothing. And government programs are the same way. It's not neutral if you don't recognize God in any way. It's naked. Our fifth stop is the 1970s through the mid-1990s, when government did attempt to provide some clothing for the naked. During this period, the federal government made grants to groups such as Catholic Charities, Lutheran Social Services, and so forth, religious groups with a great heritage, but ones that increasingly looked like secular groups, because very often, and it varies from place to place with these groups, but for the most part, they essentially made a deal. If an implicit agreement could have words, the words would have been these for these groups. Do not talk about Christ. Do not make waves. Then you may pass go, and you may collect $200 or $200 million. Let me make a theological point here and then a constitutional one. First, the theology. It's sometimes said that some of these what have become government lookalikes are religious only in name. But that's a misreading of theological diversity. These groups practice what is sometimes called the ministry of the deed. As one slightly sappy song puts it, they'll know we are Christians by our love. These groups eschew the ministry of the word. They won't tell people about Christ either because they don't believe in the reality of Christ themselves, or in many cases because as part of their theology. They don't believe that verbal transmission of Christianity is essential or necessary. And I would argue that certainly if you look at the situations in the New Testament where Jesus fed people to mass feedings of 5,000 and 4,000 both times, Jesus fed them after he had preached to them for a long time. And they were in a faraway place where there weren't food supplies. So I would argue, but this is my theological position, that essentially spiritual food and material food should go together. Both of them are essential. Others may disagree. They may say, well, no, we're only going to provide material food and that's our religion. But that's exactly the point. It is a religious viewpoint. And now the constitutional point. This theologically liberal Christianity is a religion. And giving money to theologically liberal groups while refusing to give money to theologically conservative groups certainly violates the First Amendment's ban on giving preference to any particular religion or religious point of view. But here's one situation we're in. Theologically liberal groups are now central in the dispensing of social services to the poor. And so at this point we can conform to the First Amendment in either of two ways. Eliminate governmental discretionary grants to social service agencies, or distribute them in a non-discriminatory way. Our sixth stop is 1995 and 1996. The Republican Revolution of 1995 included an assault on the bankrolling of some social service groups. And that revolution failed. So now there's, with the failure of that dramatic attempt to, in some ways, downsize government, there's much more talk now of restructuring. And one of the things that did come out of that aborted revolution was welfare reform that has largely had a positive effect. If you walk around in inner city communities, you'll hear that from people. There have been some negative effects too, but largely positive. And then one part of welfare reform was the charitable choice provision within welfare reform. Charitable choice, at least as Republicans interpreted the measure, meant that taxpayer groups could now go to groups, taxpayer funds could now go to groups that believed in talking as well as feeding. as long as those groups would use their own funds specifically for teaching, preaching, worship, evangelism. So here you got into questions of, well, what is their bookkeeping like? How are they going to decide this, and so forth? But that's the charitable choice measure that was passed in 1996 and has not been highly publicized, but it's beginning to have some small effect. Let me mention, in a sense, step 6A, while this is going on in Washington, this whole discussion of charitable choice and so forth, there's a battle raging in Texas, a battle that really introduced George W. Bush as governor to the question of faith-based social services. And let me quote from the speech that Dr. Martin referred to that he gave that President Bush gave in 1999 in Indianapolis, introducing compassionate conservatism, his understanding of it. Quote, in 1995, Texas officials tried to close down faith-based drug treatment programs because they did not fit the regulations. When challenged that these programs were effective, one official responded, "We're not interested in results, we're interested in complying with the law." We solved that problem in Texas. If I am president, federal workers in every department of my administration will know that we value effectiveness above red tape and regulation. So Governor Bush helped this particular organization called Teen Challenge, which is a pervasively religious anti-alcoholism, anti-addiction group, has about 150 chapters around the country, one of them in San Antonio, Teen Challenge of South Texas. The Texas Commission on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse, Takata, wanted to close it down, and Governor Bush said, no, we're going to keep it open. And he then had a task force that made proposals to the legislature, and the legislature passed 3 laws to protect groups like that from regulatory abuse. And this became one of Governor Bush's fixations. We have to deregulate whenever possible. We have to judge by results. We have to look at effectiveness, however they achieve it, whether by religious means or non-religious means or standing on their head or whatever. We're looking at results. It's something is good for everyone when people who have been alcoholics or addicts or deep into poverty for years and years, when they come out of it, regardless of how they come out of it. That's good for everyone. If folks who have been in prison and they get out, if you can cut their rate of recidivism from 50% to 20%, that's good for everyone. It's good for the prisoners. It's good for the people who otherwise would be the objects of crime, and so forth. Stop 7, 1999. Governor Bush made Steve Goldsmith, who was then finishing the last of his 8 years as mayor of Indianapolis, his domestic policy advisor for the campaign. And the two of them summoned a few scholars to meet in Austin in February of 1999 to kick around some ideas. There was a lot of email traffic, a few position papers over the next few months. And the culmination was a speech by Governor Bush in Indianapolis in July, explaining what he meant by compassionate conservatism, and particularly referencing the example of some of these pervasively religious groups like Teen Challenge, or like the interchange program of Prison Fellowship down in Sugar Land, not far from here. And if you haven't been over there sometime, I would recommend going there and seeing the difference between that program, which is a pervasively faith-based program, actually in a state prison run by an evangelical group, Prison Fellowship, and see the difference between that and the regular programs. And in that prison program, it involves funding questions. Prison Fellowship pays for instructors, pays for instructional materials. The state pays for the material needs of those who participate, as it does for all prisoners. Again, the question is effectiveness. And Governor Bush in his speech laid out some principles in 1999. We will never ask an organization to compromise its core values and spiritual mission to get the help it needs. Never. We will keep a commitment to pluralism, not discriminating for or against Methodists or Mormons or Muslims or good people of no faith at all. And we will create an advocate position reporting directly to the president to ensure that charities are not secularized or slighted. Now let's go quickly to our 8th stop, January 29 this year, when all this campaign planning came to fruition. 30 leaders of faith-based organizations assembled in a dark paneled room in the White House complex. None from New York, an imam from Detroit, a long-bearded rabbi, and others were literally given seats at the table where they would also be in a good position for photo ops. Steve Goldsmith said a few words about how President Bush's faith-based initiative is about removing government's hostility to religion. And then President Bush came in, he acknowledged that his attempt to fight bias against religious groups will come under withering fire by some. He predicted a legal battle with those who demand that religion be banned from government premises, but he insisted we'll win it. And he said the first fight will be with the press corps, but I'm not the least bit concerned this is the right thing to do. And those statements were consistent with what Governor and then President Bush have been saying for the past 2 years. But there was a surprise. I mean, Steve Goldsmith, who is a hawk on deregulation and competition, did not get that job, heading the White House office, being the advocate. For 2 years it seemed to have his name on it, but there were apparently a few complications at the end. And it was agreed just prior to that announcement that there'd be a different pick. And I think this is interesting and important choice, indicating a slight move or swerve in the faith-based initiative. John DiIulio, a very good man, a Democrat who had voted for Al Gore, a person very widely respected by liberal reporters, received the position. And again, there are a whole lot of reasons for it, but here's one of the things that's going on. And I think this underscores some of the complications. Compassionate conservatism has been an idea that's been developed to help poor people of all races and ethnicities. Now, the Bush campaign at that same time realized, I mean, in last November and December, obviously realized it had a very deep political problem. Namely, its share of the black vote in the November election was an incredibly atrocious 7%. And so the idea started to come around, well, what can we do in these programs that will help poor people but will also help politically? The ideas being that, for example, if you look back to the precedent of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, he cemented black support for the Democratic Party with some old-fashioned pork barrel politics. And that took blacks from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. And I'm all in favor, certainly, of having a Republican Party that's multicolored, multi-ethnic, vibrant. But this, in some ways, has highly influenced, I think, the recent direction of the faith-based initiative over the last couple months. It's become very much involved in the politics of trying to reach out to, particularly to blacks, which is a very good thing. But this gets you into certain questions of where the grants will be going, how that'll all be decided, how you keep a level playing field for everyone, how you don't discriminate either racially or religiously or anything else. It's raised some interesting and important complications. Again, I want, desperately, I've traveled around the country. Most of the groups that I covered and fell in love with were inner-city black groups. I want to see them get more resources. The question is how. But this is one complication that needs to be talked about. And that became immediately apparent as we go to stop 9, that all through February, exactly what was anticipated as far as the pressure that would come on the faith-based advocates, it happened. Enormous pressure from the left, enormous pressure from Jewish groups, very concerned about that, for reasons I very well understand, believe me. And we can go into that later on too. I come from a Jewish background. I know what it's like. I know the pressures that religious minorities can face in relation to religious majorities. So enormous pressures. And there was movement. The faith-based initiative, the idea was you always had to keep it on, it was known it was walking a tightrope. But you had to keep very careful, you had to be very careful not to swerve in one direction or the other, and it started swerving left, in a sense in relation to those criticisms from the left. And it started swerving in a way to try to assuage the very legitimate concerns of Jewish groups. I could give you some examples here, but I don't want to go into a whole lot of the detail right now, just in the interest of time. But John, under pressure, again, a very good man, when asked, for example, can an evangelical group like Teen Challenge, that's pervasively religious, can it get a grant from the government? And when asked this, before a group of 300 Jewish leaders who associate proselytizing with the type of horrible stuff that went on in Europe. You know, my great-grandfather was killed in a pogrom, and that's the association of proselytizing. John responded, well, no, of course not. They're not going to get grants. Definitely no. And that was the backing away from this level playing field idea. This idea that we just care about effectiveness. We don't care how they accomplish their mission. If they can help addicts or alcoholics or poor people generally, then that's what we want to look at. There was a backing away from that during my 9th stop, which brings us to the 10th stop, the month of March, where what was entirely unexpected, or largely unexpected, came to being an enormous outcry from the right, and particularly from evangelical groups, saying, we are now facing discrimination. And this is wrong. It's constitutionally wrong. It's theologically discriminatory. We want to fight that. And that's where the opposition largely has been coming, along with still coming from the left in many ways. The opposition has been coming from the right. And so John, I mean, suddenly an academic, a professor thrown into politics, faces a two-front war. It's been very, very hard. And there are some of the nuances in this. Essentially, John then responding to that criticism said, okay, we'll still be willing to fund some of these pervasively religious groups as long as they can segment their religious parts and their non-religious parts. So, for example, sure, I mean, if they can say from 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock is prayer time, or from 7 to 7:30 is sermon time, then they pay for that themselves, we can pay for other stuff, so be it. And that was different from the campaign understanding, which was that if you had a pervasively religious group, much as with prison fellowship, you would not want to see the government actually paying for the instructors or the instructional material or anything like that, but the government possibly could pay for light bulbs and lunches, basic infrastructure needs. But that, of course, drives the left crazy, and if you don't say that, it drives the right crazy. So here's the situation we're in right now. It's very, very difficult. And let me just give you one quick example, and then I will stop, of how it is so difficult. It's difficult certainly with a group like Teen Challenge, because Teen Challenge believes that the way to fight addiction and alcoholism is through conversion. Their theory, and they do have a good track record to back up that this theory has some legs, their theory is that people become addicts or alcoholics because they have holes in their souls. They, in fact, would say all of us do, and maybe we don't become addicts or alcoholics. Maybe we start searching mightily for power or sex or money or something. And they would say the way that addicts come out of the addiction is if the holes in their souls are filled by Jesus Christ. So you cannot segment, you cannot separate their evangelism and their counseling. Their counseling is their evangelism is their counseling. But let me give you very, very quickly a more subtle example. This is from my own church in Austin. We have a program called New Start for folks who have been on welfare or in prison. A week ago, we had a class on budgeting. And the instructor began by distinguishing among needs, wants, and desires. He quoted the Apostle Paul as saying, if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. And then he further explained his classification by citing other Bible verses. He stressed the importance of taking care of family members by quoting a verse from Paul's first epistle to Timothy. If anyone does not provide for his own and those of his household, he has denied the faith. The instructor taught about the need to pay debts by quoting from Psalm 37, the wicked borrows and is not paid back, but the righteous is gracious. And so the 10 people in the class, black, brown, white, they seemed impressed that they were learning not just, 7 habits for savings by some best-selling author, but wisdom imparted from God. What made that teaching particularly effective for those individuals was the religious teaching. And the strange thing is, and here's the quandary we're in right now, if the teaching were based on the sayings of Chairman Mao or the wisdom of Mickey Mouse, it would be eligible. But since the teaching comes from God, and it's not segmented from the teaching on budgeting, it's part of the teaching on budgeting, it's woven all the way through, then that program is ineligible. These are the complications we're in. I think there's a way out. That rather than emphasize this direct grants, which is causing so much antagonism from both the right and the left, we could move to a system of tax credits, where individuals would be able to decide where to send their social service funds. And so if evangelicals send to evangelical organizations, so be it. Jewish folks send to Jewish organizations, Muslims to Islamic organizations, so be it. That's a way, I think, of being a uniter rather than a divider. And I don't see any way to slice it in the current debate right now, is that if one side wins, the other side wins, we're still going to end up with an enormously divisive situation. But maybe we'll be able to talk more about tax credits later on.
Mark Palavin is the Associate Director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism and is one of the Jewish community's leading legislative strategists, and having worked in Washington for over 15 years, one of its senior lobbyists. The Religious Action Center has been the hub of Jewish social action, social justice, and legislative activity in the nation's capital for over 35 years. It has educated and mobilized the American Jewish community on legislative and social concerns as an advocate in the Congress on issues ranging from Israel, Soviet Jewry, to economic justice and civil rights, international peace, religious liberty, and similar issues. The Religious Action Center is the Washington office of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations and the Central Conference of American Rabbis, representing 1.5 million Reform Jews and 1,800 Reform rabbis in 870 congregations throughout North America. The center has been a leading opponent of charitable choice since it was first inserted into law in 1996. It has long contended that charitable choice will inevitably encourage actions that are religiously divisive and will breach the wall of separation which until now has prohibited government interference in private sectarian affairs. Not surprisingly, the center has taken a strong interest in the House Bill H.R. 7 introduced last Friday by Representative J.C. Watts of Oklahoma and Tony Hall of Ohio and others that would expand charitable choice provisions in virtually every government-funded social service program. Mark Palavin has been a key voice in calling for extreme care in breaching this metaphorical wall between religion and government, with particular concern for preserving the liberties and rights of Jews and others who do not belong to the Christian majority. So we welcome him tonight to express his views and those of the center.
Well, thank you for that introduction, for the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you tonight. As Professor Martin mentioned, I help run the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, meaning I represent in Washington almost 900 congregations, a word we used to use to describe what we now call faith-based organizations. On behalf of those congregations, I want to argue this evening that charitable choice in general, and President Bush's faith-based initiative in particular as we can know about something that is still very much evolving, are dangerous not just to our society as a whole, but to congregations and to our religious community. A word about the term charitable choice. As I suggested, and as you heard from the journey that you're just taken on so expertly, this is very much an evolving term. When I talk about charitable choice, I mean the general idea of allowing pervasively sectarian institutions to provide social welfare services with government funds. It has meant something different in the welfare reform bill and the substance abuse bill that passed a couple years later. And as President Bush talked about it on the campaign trail, and as he rolled it out at the White House ceremony, and as Dr. DiIlio and Stephen Goldsmith and others have kind of elaborated on it over the past couple of weeks and months. It is very much a moving target, and we can talk later on, I hope, about the legislation that's been introduced and about some of the important distinctions between these different variations on a theme. So we can get into it more later on, but when I talk about charitable choice, I really want to talk at a somewhat broader level about this idea of government funding of sectarian social welfare institutions. And I want to argue that charitable choice is unconstitutional, that it's unwise, and that it's unnecessary. Before I do that, I want to stop for a minute and dispel what I think are a couple of really troubling myths that are dragging down this debate. Myths about what this debate is and is not about. First, the debate over charitable choice is not a debate over the question of whether religious groups should be working to alleviate poverty or address other societal concerns. Supporters and opponents of charitable choice alike argue that building a better world answers some of the highest callings of our religious traditions. Across the country today, every day, men and women of all faiths and of none selflessly care for our children, serve the elderly, heal the sick, lift up the poor, and cure the addicted. And it cannot be said clearly enough that the advocates for charitable choice, Professor Orlansky key among them, deserve credit for forcing policymakers and, to a degree, the American public as a whole to focus on something they have long ignored: the reality and persistence of poverty today. That said, and meant heartfeltly, as I'll discuss in a few minutes, I believe that charitable choice would detract from, rather than argue for, rather than advance anti-poverty efforts. Second, the debate about charitable choice is not about whether government and religious organizations can ever work together. It's not about whether there is a role for religious social welfare groups, but whether about the size of that role, how that role will be defined, and what the relationship with government can be. Again, cannot be said clearly enough. There is a place for such cooperation. The debate is not about whether we will have that cooperation, but about the nature of it, about the context of the relationship. No one that I'm aware of, even I'm guessing my friend Sam, is arguing that the wall of separation between church and state is so impregnable that religion has no place in the public policy arena, no place providing social welfare services. Third, this debate is not about discriminating against religion or freeing religion from discrimination. Discrimination is, of course, a loaded word. We have a long history of treating religion differently in this country. It's another way of saying discriminating. We treat religion differently than we treat other things in this country. Sometimes it means religion is advantaged. Sometimes it means, in some senses, religion is disadvantaged. But we have, starting from the first words of the First Amendment of our Constitution, we've decided we're going to treat religion differently. And we're going to do so not because we don't value religion, not because we don't believe religion has a place in our public square, but just the opposite. Because of the high value that we place on religion, we're going to give it a preferential place in our constitutional hierarchy. We're going to discriminate. We're going to treat religion differently than we treat other things. Discrimination, as I said, is a loaded word. But rest assured, the idea of treating religion differently than we treat other things is an important part of our history and of the fabric of our society. That said, what is the debate about? The debate is about whether or not government funds should be allowed to flow to religious institutions to further their religious missions. The debate is about whether or not government funds should support, for example, the Central Union Mission in Washington, D.C., whose director recently told the Washington Post that he is really in the business of making disciples. We believe the answer for these people, for his clients, is Christ. We don't know any other way to meet their needs without sharing the gospel with them. The Central Union mission, then, is, to their credit, in the business of making disciples. Our question tonight is, should the government be in that business as well? Opponents of charitable choice often argue that it's unconstitutional and that it will undermine the wall of separation between church and state. I trust you'll not be surprised, but I will argue that as well this evening. But I want to take just a minute and step back from the church-state debate for a moment to consider the purpose of that oft-discussed wall of separation. I think that too much of the discussion about the importance of the wall or the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment is divorced from its root. It's divorced from its history. The Establishment Clause and the wall of separation, the metaphor that kind of gives it life, are not ends unto themselves. They are rather the means by which our framers sought to arrive at the most highly valued of goals, the goal of religious liberty. The wall of separation, therefore, serves not to protect government from religion, but rather to protect religion from the heavy hand of government. And it has worked magnificently. It is a major part of the success of the American experiment. It's been precisely because of that wall. That wall has allowed religion to flourish in America as nowhere else around the world, with a diversity and a strength and a vitality and a power unique in the Western democratic world. It's no accident that America enjoys a type of religious strength and religious diversity and religious vitality that it does. The question of separation of church and state is therefore not an abstract principle of interest only to lawyers and to professors. It is the instrument which has undergirded the remarkable religious tapestry of our nation. And I believe it follows that attacks on the wall of separation should be of concern first and foremost to those who care about religion. And that has always been true in the United States. We've not allowed government funding of churches, synagogues, or mosques. That's been a first principle of the First Amendment. James Madison wrote, "The appropriation of funds of the United States for the use and support of religious societies is contrary to the article of the Constitution which declares that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion." And Jefferson, perhaps characteristically, put a somewhat stronger point on it, saying that the government taking of someone's money and giving it to a religion which may be anathema to him is sinful and tyrannical. Sinful, tyrannical, and he might have added, ultimately dangerous for religion. Because with government funds, inevitably and appropriately come government strings, government rules, and government regulations. President Bush, for example, has often stressed the importance of accountability, that schools and other recipients of federal funds need to be held accountable for the results that they achieve or that they fail to achieve. And he's not wrong. Taxpayers have a right to know what results are being arrived at with what the president often reminds us is their money. So too, it seems, for religious organizations, including houses of worship. Speaking in Philadelphia this past weekend, John DiIllo, the director of the White House Office on Faith-Based and Community Outreach, suggested that the administration would impose annual audits to ensure that funds did not continue to go to groups whose programs failed. Parenthetical question, whose programs failed at what? Remember, Central Union Mission's goal is to create disciples. As for such audits and other type of oversight, Congressman Chet Edwards has warned, I think rightly, that it will be a religious nightmare to have federal agents, including IRS agents, auditing the finances of churches, synagogues, and mosques across the land. And he's right. In addition to the threat to their traditional and cherished and valued autonomy, government funding of houses of worship creates another, more subtle, but equally alarming danger: the undermining of the mission of the institutions. To be sure, I don't think that erosion of the character of religious institutions will be intentional or will be immediate, but it is likely nonetheless. As my colleague, Reverend Brent Walker, the director of the Baptist Joint Committee on Public Affairs, has observed, when religion dines at the public trough, it sounds better if I had a good drawl. When religion dines at the public trough, it becomes lazy and complacent. It must maintain its prophetic edge if it is to call government to account. The Wall Street Journal published an interesting example of the type of mission creep, the type of change in the character of organizations that's possible, perhaps inevitable, as religious institutions look to government as the source of its funds. The state of Massachusetts underwrites a large percentage of the charitable work undertaken by Catholic Charities in Massachusetts, about which more in a moment. Catholic Charities. In the mid-1980s, the state began to shift its funding away from other areas towards substance abuse programs. As the funding shifted, so did the programs offered by Catholic Charities. Programs such as soup kitchens and child care closed, and drug abuse and alcohol treatment programs opened. By 1995, Catholic Charities in Massachusetts spent some 80% of their funds on substance abuse programs. Stanley Carlton Tease, a leading policy analyst who's now working in the White House Office on Faith-Based Advocacy, has termed this shift of emphasis vendorism, a process in which government grants end up diverting and distorting the priorities of charitable institutions, changing their direction, and turning them into mere vendors of government programs. As you may by now have guessed, my attempt to carefully delineate the constitutional issues, constitutional objections to charitable choice, and the public policy objections is only going to be somewhat marginally successful. They bleed over onto one another, and they are tightly interwoven. So with the danger to religious institutions in mind, let me turn to a few of the broader public policy concerns. First, discrimination. Charitable choice advocates, charitable choice occupies an uncomfortable place between two fundamental principles of our democracy. The religious institutions, on the one hand, should be given broad latitude to operate as they see fit, and on the other, the general rule that institutions which receive federal funds should not be allowed to discriminate with those funds. We recognize the right of the Catholic Church, for example, to decide not to ordain women as priests, but we demand the recipients of federal funds abide by the rules and regulations I mentioned, including civil rights laws. For religious programs, the ability to discriminate in hiring is the very mechanism by which they carry out their goals. Religious social service programs are effective, their supporters argue, because they are religious, offering religious messages. That message can only be effectively delivered, they argue, probably not wrongly, by a co-religionist. I don't dispute the logic. I would only argue that under our system, the necessary corollary to the decision to discriminate is to forego government funds. That, for example, is a choice that Central Union Mission has made. You may have seen the powerful story on this point in the New York Times Magazine this past Sunday, which noted that my organization recently joined the NAACP, other organizations, in writing to President Bush on exactly this issue, saying that it would be unconscionable that a want ad for government-supported social service program could read, for example, Catholics and Jews need not apply. Second, the second complication, divisiveness. Representative Edwards observed recently that if I were maliciously trying to design a federal program to undermine the religious tolerance in America that we've enjoyed for over 200 years, I could not think of a better way to do it than to put billions of dollars, almighty dollars, on the table, and let religious groups and entities compete for them. And he's already been proven right. In the past month or so, we've begun to see a troubling ugliness creep into this debate. Reverend Jerry Falwell suggested that Islamic organizations should never be entitled to receive government funding because the Muslim faith teaches hate. And Reverend Rivers, who you've already heard about a little bit this evening, has argued that opponents of charitable choice on the right and on the left are racially motivated, arguing that their concern is that federal money will go to inner city and largely African American churches. The religious right and the secular left, Rivers has argued, Rivers told the website BeliefNet this week, share an indifference to the needs of the poor and the inner city. This type of nasty sectarian wrangling will, I'm afraid, only get worse. It will only begin to tear away at the very fabric of our society. And once the money's on the table, how will government officials choose who to fund? Will only some religions be funded? Perhaps only the popular ones? What about minority or unpopular religions? When asked about the possibility of funding the Nation of Islam, President Bush said that his initiative wouldn't fund groups who preach hatred. But hate, as Reverend Falwell's comment illustrates, is not a term of art. It is very much in the eye of the beholder. One other complication. I too have been impressed with the effectiveness of many of the programs which you heard about this evening, which the President has talked about and held up as powerful examples. They have done wonderful and remarkable work addressing some of the most difficult issues that our society has to face. It doesn't follow to me that the answer to that is to turn them into government programs. I worry very much when we talk about religious liberty concerns. I worry very much that by embracing these programs, government may in fact embrace them too tightly and smother them and extinguish the spark that is within them. As the dangers that I've touched upon, the threat to the autonomy of religious organizations, the subtle undermining of their mission, the threats of discrimination, divisiveness, these threats are all the more ominous because I want to suggest to you finally, they're unnecessary. The goals of the Bush initiative can be achieved without blasting a hole through the wall of separation. I mentioned earlier that this is not a debate about whether religious organizations, whether religious communities should work with government to address societal problems, but rather how they should do so. And it's no secret that a number of the largest recipients of federal funds today are religiously affiliated organizations, such as Catholic Charities or Jewish Family Services or Lutheran Relief. The U.S. Supreme Court has long recognized, though, an important distinction between pervasively sectarian institutions on the one hand, churches, synagogues, seminaries, places where the religious mission is so tightly interwound with everything that they do that it simply cannot be tweezed apart from it. The courts distinguish between those pervasively sectarian institutions on the one hand and what it calls religiously affiliated institutions on the other hand. That's Catholic Charities. That's a Jewish Federation system. That's a lot of the organizations that are right now today doing this kind of work. Those are groups that are providing what we would usually agree are generally secular services, and doing so under some religious auspices, but are providing secular services. They're being funded largely by the government, I think appropriately by the government. And there's certainly much room to build more such partnerships. Allow me one final observation. I think the dangers posed by the President's initiative are serious and far-reaching. I think the damage to our nation and to its religious institutions in particular could be profound. And for what? The President's plan, as it now stands, doesn't appear to add a single dime to the government's commitment to end poverty. All it does is provide increased competition for existing dollars. So under the current plan, with all its dangers, there's no guarantee that a single new person will be helped, that a single life will be touched and improved. With such high costs and such questionable benefits, charitable choices offered the religious institutions and the public more broadly would be wise to reject. Thank you.
Samantha Smoot is Executive Director of the Texas Freedom Network, which is an independent nonprofit organization that it comprises more than 7,500 religious and community leaders and is designed to provide a mainstream voice to counter the religious right. And it serves as a major resource to public news media. It's been featured in stories in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and other publications. It didn't take any charity to see Sam Smoot as an excellent choice to be on our program this evening. In Texas, for obvious reasons, charitable choice has taken on great significance. We've talked already about how when he was governor, George Bush led campaigns implementing aggressive or emphasizing aggressive implementation of charitable choice legislation. Soon after the federal legislation passed, the governor pulled together a pro-charitable choice faith-based task force made up of 16 clergy and volunteer leaders to offer recommendations for the application of charitable choice and other faith-based initiatives in Texas. Almost all of these recommendations were passed by the 1997 Texas legislature, including legislation that allowed faith-based child care centers and homes to bypass state licensing and regulation by creating a private accreditation system. In 1999, the legislature passed House Bill 2017, which requires the Texas Department of Human Services and the Texas Workforce Commission and its local counterparts to actively promote the spirit and letter of charitable choice and to seek out increased partnerships with faith-based organizations for the provision of social services. The Texas Freedom Network, working with the Texas Faith Network, an organization that includes 400 clergy, has monitored the progress of charitable choice programs, asking repeatedly, what do these programs profess to be doing? Are they doing it? How well? Are they working within the guidelines of the legislation? What problems exist? And so forth. Sam Smoot is here to tell us what she and her colleagues have found. Sam.
Well, as Bill suggests, I have less inspirational and more practical material to work here. But I think that we're very fortunate in Texas because so much of the debate about so-called charitable choice is on the theoretical level. But here in Texas, we do have a 5-year track record of aggressively implementing this idea in these programs. In fact, Texas was one of only 2 states to receive an A for the thoroughness and enthusiasm with which we implemented charitable choice. So I do want to examine some of the programs that we've seen here in Texas over the past 5 years to try to glean some lessons and apprise us of some of the dangers that could be ahead if this becomes expanded as federal policy. I was looking through our research material. We've been researching charitable choice in Texas actively on a daily basis for 9 months now, and we keep thinking that we will finish our report in 2 months, to 1 or 2 months' time. And as I talk, you'll begin to understand why we haven't finished yet. But I was realizing that I'm not even sure where to start. There is a lot of material to talk about here, and if it's true that the devil is in the details of even a good idea, then certainly the same is exponentially true of this particular, or when it comes to a bad one. And you may have guessed that I think that this is a bad one. And so the array of problems, just to sort of toss out a quick litany, and actually both Professor Olasky and Mr. Palavin, thank you. Mark is what I'm used to calling Mark, laid out a lot of the problems with implementation already. Everything from how are the results tracked? How is the spending tracked? Who decides who gets money and who doesn't get money? What about loosening regulations for religious groups? Does that level the playing field, or does that make it less level? Because that gives special treatment to faith-based groups. How should churches and other religious groups segregate funds if, in fact, that becomes the policy? Even if funds are segregated, should the government then have the right to audit, as has been suggested, a religious institution? So it's a Pandora's box of problems that we are poised to open here, and I hope that you'll leave here tonight thinking that this is the founders of our country and the writers of our Constitution may in fact have been onto something when they said that religion shall not be involved in government and vice versa. I believe, and we'll get specific about the problems in a moment, but I do want to say that I believe that ultimately the problems with implementation of charitable choice come down to this, that the most fundamental rights of both religious communities and of tax-paying citizens in a democracy, when it comes to mixing public money and the practice of religion, are irreconcilable. On the one side, faith groups have the right to autonomy and freedom from government intervention into their programmatic and their fiscal affairs. This has always been the case in this country, and it should always continue to be so. But on the other side, taxpayers and citizens have the right to some accountability for how their funds are spent, and also to expect their government to guarantee a basic level of health and safety standards. Proponents of charitable choice, especially in the past few weeks as the debate has heated up and some of the questions that my co-panelists have alluded to have come to the fore, proponents of charitable choice have suggested some new schemes for trying to satisfy the rights of both groups while still mixing taxpayer funds in the practice of religion. I think in the coming weeks you'll hear more about grants. You'll hear about vouchers instead of grants. Professor Olasky alluded to tax credits instead of vouchers instead of grants. You're going to hear it sort of like the public funding of private school voucher debate. You're going to hear these things start to be called some different things in the coming weeks as proponents try to reconcile the rights of these two groups. But I believe that they can't do it. Either the rights of religious groups will supersede those of the tax-paying public, or the rights of taxpayers will supersede those of the autonomy of faith groups. Either would be a terribly, terribly dangerous precedent for this country. First, I want to make one sort of vocabulary note. And Mark expressed this very well, but I think that it's critical to touch on this point once more because it's a great misunderstanding, I believe. We're hearing so much about faith-based groups now and charitable choice and so forth. But it is true, as Professor Olasky said, that religiously affiliated organizations in this country have always been a primary provider of services to those in need. And certainly since the Second World War, these large institutions like Lutheran services, Jewish family services, Catholic charities are really, in many communities, the primary providers of services. There's an important distinction here between religiously affiliated social service providers and what is loosely called now faith-based groups, which generally refers to those that are pervasively sectarian, where the evangelism and practice of religion is inseparable from the service itself. Now, it's important to realize this because the change that we are discussing to take what is really a pretty small funding stream and a small provision in the welfare reform bill and expand it from a drip and a drop to a torrent of $8 billion worth of funding to religious social services. The distinction is enormous. We are talking about beginning to fund those organizations and activities that we have not funded before in our country's history. It is those, as Mark mentioned, where the real goal is to make disciples of people. It is those like Teen Challenge, which Marvin mentioned, where the goal is to help people fill the holes in their souls with God. It is not, we're not talking about Catholic charities. We're not talking about St. Luke's Episcopal Hospital. I actually chatted with Carla from St. Luke's earlier today, and she said, I see, we're not faith-based, but you know, I really like the term faith-based. And I thought after we talked, you know, I suspect that's why so many politicians like to use it too, because it is a warm term, and she made a great point. It accurately reflects the spirit of mission of that organization. But it's a very important distinction between those types of groups that are independent nonprofit charities that have a strong religious affiliation but provide secular services, and those where proselytization is an integral, inseparable part of the service they provide. That is the essence of the change that we're talking about here. And to my mind, it's something of a red herring. It reminds me of the red herring often thrown out in the prayer in schools debate that children should be allowed to pray in schools, when in fact children are allowed to pray in schools, and the old joke is that as long as there are exams, there will be prayers in schools. To me, this notion that we are keeping people of faith out of social services is a real red herring, because so many good people of faith are actively, daily providing social services and doing so in partnership with the government, often, and sometimes not doing so in partnership with the government. But I think that this notion that our government is hostile to religion, I think that if more people understood how many religiously affiliated charities were out there and how many thousands of people were involved in making those programs work every day, then that would really change the dialogue about this issue, because any church can tomorrow, within its congregation, form a 501c3 nonprofit organization separate from their church, agree not to proselytize and not discriminate against the people they hire, and begin to compete for government monies. Any congregation can do this tomorrow. And so one of the questions is, of course, why then are we looking at this dangerous path of directly funding religious services? You know, let me talk about, let me get specific, as I promised, and talk about some of the real issues with implementation that Texas has grappled with, and I should say is only now beginning to grapple with, because even though we've got a 5-year track record here, these are still very young programs. State officials will tell you that they have just begun to start implementing these programs. And so I really do believe it will be years and years down the road before we have any kind of real evidence for judging not only how effective programs were and how effective the competition and distribution mechanism was, but also it may be years before we even know how much money is, for instance, the state of Texas spending on faith-based programs. I can't tell you that, and neither can anyone else. And so we are in kind of a muddle right now. Nonetheless, through this sort of murky picture of a lot of information, a lot of pieces missing from the puzzle, I will tell you some of the things my organization has learned in our research and draw a couple of conclusions. The charitable choice program that's been proposed nationally is really sort of a three-pronged creature. In Texas, there were 2 prongs. The first prong nationally is something different than we had in Texas, and it has to do with tax policy. And the chief provision, and actually Mark and Marvin are both much more knowledgeable about this than I, and can correct me if I'm wrong, but the chief provision is a tax credit for the 70% of Americans who don't currently itemize on their income tax. They would be able to have a tax credit of up to $500 for contributions to charitable or religious organizations. We've not had that kind of tax policy in Texas. And so I won't get into that specifically, only I really do want to make the note that the tax policy I believe should be looked at as a whole, because on the one hand, what is being proposed is to increase deductions for the 70% who don't itemize, which generally is middle and lower income Americans. On the other hand, with the repeal of the, and which should have a beneficial effect, financial effect on charities and houses of worship. On the other hand, what's being proposed is cutting the estate tax, which many have speculated would have extremely dire consequences for nonprofit organizations and houses of worship. So I would add that we should look at that as the big picture. The other two prongs of charitable choice, the next one coming nationally, is that President Bush has ordered basically an audit of government regulations of several federal agencies. He has put together teams of people to go through regulations and find those that he thinks are unduly burdensome to religious groups. In Texas, there was a similar effort, and it came in the form of a package of legislation. Two bills in particular were designed to loosen regulations for religiously based social service programs. And I think these are very telling, and we actually do have some results and numbers on these. There were two. One had to do with faith-based child care and children's homes facilities. And this bill allowed for alternative private accreditation, so as opposed to state regulation of these homes. So that a religious home could opt to go and obtain accreditation from another entity and not have to deal directly with the state. Well, I will mention just in passing that the only two people who showed up 4 years ago to testify in favor of this legislation were a pair of Florida-based attorneys for the roll-off homes. I assume that many of you here have heard of the roll-off homes. One private accrediting agency has been set up under this legislation. It's called TACA, the Texas Association of Christian Child Care Agencies. TACA has accredited 8 children's homes, one of which is now closed, so there are 7 homes that are accredited privately through TACA. Now, for the homes themselves, this is the bill's original sponsor actually admitted last week in a committee hearing he was surprised there did not seem to be the demand for this that they anticipated, 7 out of 2,000. And he was surprised by this. Part of the reason may be that this is actually more costly for the faith-based service providers. To be regulated or accredited through TACA will cost about $1,500 a year. For a smaller sized children's home or child care facility. To be regulated by the state is a $35 fee. And so the reason for the extra cost, of course, is that we're setting up an alternative parallel bureaucracy, and it's either got to be paid for by the government or privately. One of the issues that's come up is religious discrimination, and the vice chair of the board of TACA testified in the same committee hearing last week. He was asked by a legislator, Representative Noriega of Houston, given the name TACA, Texas Association of Christian Child Care Agencies, Representative Noriega wondered if they would accredit a Muslim or a Hindu or a Jewish children's home. And the vice chair of the board said, no, I don't believe we would do that. You know, it seemed as though he had not thought about this issue, but certainly discrimination is part of the problem of implementation. We did a little bit of research into not only the cost, but how had these programs been doing. And we found out something alarming, which is that the rate of abuse and neglect complaints against the 8 homes regulated by TACA was about 10 times that of the state, of all the other homes in the state, religious and non-religious. Now, that was disturbing, but I think more disturbing is the whole premise of having alternative private accreditation is to provide a buffer between the government and the faith-based agency. In this case, these centers happen to have a higher rate of abuse and neglect claims, but the law itself and the whole alternative accreditation mechanism, which I think Professor Olasky would say is designed to protect these types of groups from regulatory abuse, in fact, put some of the kids that are, you know, clients at these homes in danger, because the state of Texas is not permitted to check on the regulation of the homes or even the alternative accreditation procedures unless there is a complaint, or unless they have reason to learn that the alternative accreditation points are not being met and the children are in immediate danger. This is the kind of buffer that has been created in the name of protecting groups from regulatory abuse. And so you probably know that a year ago more arrests were made at the roll-off homes. TACA has subsequently reaccredited the roll-off homes. By the way, that original legislation is up for reauthorization now, and if you want to hear more about it, I'd be happy to tell you. But certainly on the child care front, what we've learned is that there is not a demand for this, which is very instructive. Of the 2,000 faith-based child care agencies out there, the vast majority of them are very happy to comply with basic health and safety standards that protect the kids that are in their care. Only 7 of them preferred this costly alternative. Let me move now to the second kind of loosening regulations that we've had in Texas, which is on drug treatment centers. We've had 2 pieces of legislation. Basically, they say that if you are a faith-based, non-medical substance abuse treatment center, then you are exempted from state regulations. All you have to do is register with the state. Professor Olasky talked about the incident in 1995 when Teen Challenge was in danger of being shut down by the state. You know, despite the unfortunate comment of the bureaucrat who said, we don't care about results, we care about the law, it should be noted that Teen Challenge had been found for a period of years to be in violation of several counts of the law. Everything from not having licensed counselors, improper intake for procedures, no follow-up with their clients, and so on and so forth. So there's some question about whether or not it makes sense to exempt any kind of treatment center from the law. A subsequent law required that groups like Teen Challenge, these non-medical centers, were not required to direct clients to medical care. And so this brings me to the second point, which again has been raised by both of my colleagues, which is if a drug treatment center has as part of its drug treatment philosophy that substance abuse is a sin, whether it be holes in our souls or whatever particular philosophy is held, that substance abuse is a sin, it's not a disease. And so the appropriate treatment is worship and the practice of religion, not medical treatment. And in this case, in the case of Teen Challenge and some of these other homes, instead of or at the expense of medical treatment. It raises a number of questions for us. First of all, are we not giving special treatment to these programs by exempting them? Are we not perhaps putting some people in need in danger or at risk? And what about the fact that our society holds a point of view that is secular but is also grounded in decades of medical research on such matters, that substance abuse is a disease and that it has a strong biological component? And what about all the work that's been done by healthcare advocates to remove shame and stigma from something like substance abuse? So a lot of questions are raised by these 2 programs and the implementation of them in Texas. Let me move on to the third prong of charitable choice, because this is where it gets good. It is the grants. It's the money, and it always gets good when you get to the money. It's been projected that the Bush administration may not actually get to a grant-making portion of this until the end of the year. I think it depends on how the federal legislation goes and a lot of other factors. But regardless, at some point, there will be some, presuming that this passes, there will be some disbursement of some funds to someone. It's very interesting to think about who might get this money. It's been discussed, Mark mentioned that Governor Bush on the campaign trail first said that of course the Nation of Islam would get funds, and then he said, well, no, of course the Nation of Islam would not get funds. Mr. DiIulio has had a similar change of opinion about whether or not Teen Challenge, a very evangelical group, would qualify. My favorite probably is Pat Robertson, who woke up one day and realized that Hare Krishnas and Moonies might get this money. I think that it doesn't matter which group getting money makes you uncomfortable. You know, we heard that, and I think that this is a point well taken, that a prominent African-American minister believes that a lot of the discomfort about this is discomfort about money going to inner-city black churches. My feeling is that it doesn't matter what might make you uncomfortable. I think that we all have reason to be deeply uncomfortable with the notion of our public monies going to underwrite the practice of a religion which may or may not be our own. And I think the fact that Pat Robertson came out with his concerns is really just evidence of Americans' discomfort about this idea. Other, I think, more important concerns about who gets the money and who decides who gets the money are some of those that Mark mentioned. Will the money be dispersed by those who have political power? Will it be dispersed to gain political power? And I think Professor Olasky alluded to the fact that the charitable choice debate has begun to evolve into a political outreach program on behalf of the Bush administration. And what about the competition that will result once parish is competing against parish for the same funds, or a particular parish is competing against Catholic charities for the same dollar, a synagogue is competing against Jewish family services, or what about a well-meaning Methodist church that is now in competition for funds with aid to victims of domestic violence? Suddenly, with a shrinking pot of money, we are all going after the same money. And it's not as simple as black churches against white churches. We're going to see big churches having an advantage over small churches. We're going to see wars between evangelical suburban congregations and small rural ones. It is a nightmare, truly, to contemplate this. And I think the effect on the faith community will be devastating. Who tracks the money? It's my hope that if we embark on this federally, we could do a better job than we've been able to do in Texas. I can tell you that 2 state agencies have spent the money in Texas. It's the Department of Human Services and the Texas Workforce Commission. Between the 2 of them, last fiscal year, they spent $10 million. The trouble is, the Workforce Commission also has 28 regional boards, and each of them spent money. And in fact, it looks as though the bulk of the charitable choice money was spent at that level. We've been able to find and concretely count another $3.5 million, but we're still counting. The numbers that the state has released are that 2,300 programs have been funded here in Texas, by the way. What's not clear, because what has never been tracked before, is how many of those programs are the ones I described that are religiously affiliated, as opposed to these new faith-based programs, and so have been receiving funding all along anyway, and how many of them are the new programs. We're not clear yet. The issue of separating the money, funding the bread and not the Bibles, whether or not there can be a separate bank account, a separate accounting line item. Some of my colleagues in Washington have expressed concern that churches and other faith groups are going to be lured into a legal quagmire because there really is no way, accounting-wise, to segregate the funds. And even if you do segregate the funds somehow, you are still subject someday to some sort of government audit of the funds, of your books, your religious entities' books. And then finally, a word about results. I think this is a real problem in implementation of charitable choice. How do we characterize the results of a program? So many of these programs are so new, and yes, there have been some wonderful success stories, but even though some of these programs have turned around lives for people, doesn't mean, A, that we should fund them, or B, that they are for everyone. We're so early in the process of this that, for instance, Interchange, which is a voluntary prison program here in Texas, claims that all 26 of their clients who graduated from the program are still employed outside the prison. Well, the trouble is we don't know how many clients fell off along the way. 26 is not a very big number to be able to use as any kind of statistical sample. We really don't know much. Teen Challenge, which claims an incredible success rate, I mentioned to you that one of the ways in which they were violating state law is that they didn't have any kind of follow-up with the people they were helping. So if you don't have a follow-up procedure, how do you know if they're still clean and sober a year or 2 years later? So there are problems certainly with results, and I have to mention, because I think it's important, that one of the things I read that Professor Olasky said that intrigued me was he expressed concern that once charitable choice began to grow, and I think his concern may have been realized already, that the media would not know how to cover the issue, because the news media, and frankly many of us, are used to judging programs in terms of their immediate success rate here on earth by the numbers. But in fact, the goal of many of these faith-based programs doesn't have much to do with what happens here on earth. Their goals are eternal. And so I don't think he meant it as a joke, and I didn't either. I think it's a real issue. What is success when you look at some of these programs? And if success is not something that we all agree is success, then should we all be having to kick in to pay for it, is the question. I will wrap up by saying that I think that the political problems with implementation, which we've all touched on but none of us have gotten into, certainly there are a host of just political problems with now that we're in here and trying to do this. There's a great power struggle within the Office of Faith-Based Action between the pragmatists represented by Giulio and those who are more to the right represented by Don Willett, who ran the program for Governor Bush here in Texas. Certainly Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell are wringing their hands over this program. Professor Olasky, whose baby this is, has some very well thought out concerns about it. You know, the far right has threatened to peel off anyway, I think that the political problems are just one thing in implementation. If we take the national back and forth on this issue and try to translate it to every county across this country, the level of heat over this argument over who gets the money, who ought to get it, who shouldn't get it, what they're doing with it, just imagine the can of worms we've opened. So I think that the political problems will continue to grow precisely because of all of these little bitty problems with implementation and the ultimate truth, which is you can't take care of the taxpayers' money and guarantee the rights of churches and faith groups to their own autonomy at the same time. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, each of you. Several of you said, or I think each of you said, we will get into this. We'll have Mark, if you've been the longest not speaking here, so I mean, Marvin, excuse me. Would you like to respond to?
On a few points. And Sam, I think, made many excellent points. She made some points that I suspect inadvertently would support my points. And then she made some points that I think are misleading. But let me deal with the good stuff first. Sure, this is the grants, particularly discretionary grants, are a problem, a big problem. And you know, we've been looking at this problem and thinking about various scenarios for the past 5 or 6 years. And yeah, the problems are the chickens are coming home to roost very fast. And it's good to see this right now. We're going to have to figure out, the people in Washington are going to have to figure out what to do, and I'm going to have to think about this a lot more. But the way you think about it, I think, is not just by thinking abstractly. You look at the realities. The reality is that, and let me just refer for a moment to Mark's point and then come back to Sam. When we talk about religious organizations being protected from government, I think of my mother, who would say, this type of protection I don't need. They're being protected by government by being marginalized in many ways, by being very, very poor, with huge resources that are spent in the social service area being spent by government and often spent very unwisely. And if you look around in Houston, in inner city Houston, you look at the private programs compared to the public programs, it's exactly the opposite of what John Kenneth Galbraith talked about 40 years ago when he was complaining about private wealth and public squalor. The governmental programs tend to be well funded. The private programs are exceptionally poorly funded. And if you compare, and there have been studies of comparing effectiveness of some of these programs, the dollar for dollar, you get a lot more from the faith-based programs and the governmental programs from what we've seen so far. A lot more studies are needed. But those are our questions when we talk about protection. If it means that programs that are not legitimized, funded by the government, being out in the margins of poverty, then you have all this money. All this money is being sucked up by governmental programs, and if it's not being spent effectively, then there are a lot of kids and a lot of adults whose lives are messed up who could be helped, and they're not being helped because the money's being often wasted. But we could go more into that. Let me get back to a couple of Sam's points here. Again, the good points, I think, the problems of divisiveness, the problems of grants, those are very real, and they're coming very fast. Now I think she actually made my point when she's talked about how the government is not hostile to religion. That's right. It is not hostile to religion. It's only hostile to some religions. It's hostile to Orthodox Judaism. It's hostile to Orthodox Islam. It's hostile to evangelical Christians. It's hostile to any group that believes that religion is part of is all of life. That there's not a segment of life that is religious and a segment of life that's non-religious. It's hostile to people for whom their religion is a real, consistent world and life view that affects everything they do, not just where they spend an hour on Saturday or Sunday or Friday, but all through the week. And it may seem from the perspective of those who are part of the favored sector that this is not a problem, but from the part of on the part of those who are not, there's a very serious problem. And again, you combine that question of equity with the question of effectiveness and whether a lot of money the taxpayers are paying is being wasted, and you fuel a situation which is just seen as both inequitable and inefficient. But I need to mention a little bit, just in terms of corrections of fact, some of the misleading things. Interchange, for example, does not have 26 graduates. It has several hundred graduates at this point. It is not, Teen Challenge, when it looks at its effectiveness, does not look at in their way of discussing public policy, does not look at what kinds of statements of faith people make. There's a common way of judging effectiveness of alcoholism and addiction programs. There are two ways, basically. Number one, how many people who enter the program actually finish the program and are sober when they come out. And number two, a year afterwards, how many are sober, how many are not, are no longer addicts a year after graduation from the program. And I will be the first to say, along with John DiIulio, that much more testing needs to be done. But there have been surveys, there have been studies, there have been academic studies, there have been governmental studies of Teen Challenge. Again, it's not a fly-by-night operation. It's been around since 1958. There are 150 chapters around the country, and it has been studied. It needs to be studied a lot more. But in terms of the studies of rates once a year after graduation, a year after completion of the program, it has shown some astounding success. And if we just leave it at, well, you know, they are against medical treatment. No, there are two philosophies that are at combat in addiction programs, in anti-addiction programs. One is called the therapeutic model, which basically says that drug addiction is a disease. The other is a faith-based model, which says you can put it, you can describe it in various ways, but let's describe it in what sounds like the harshest way, that it's a sin. These are two competing models. What the people at Teen Challenge objected to in 1995 was not any question of health and safety standards. It was not any question of looking at their cooking or whether they had fire extinguishers or anything along those lines. It was that they were being told that to counsel people, they had to go and sit in a classroom at the University of Texas or some other fine institution of our state for 270 hours, learning a philosophy that was totally alien to what they had been doing for years, and they had a track record to prove that what they'd been doing worked. You may agree with it, you may not agree with it, but this is a debate. And in many ways it's a theological debate. If you say, if there's one group of people who says that sin is something that exists, it's real, and you have another group of people who are saying, well, no, it's just, you know, psychological this, that, whatever. This is a theological debate. If you have one group of people who says, well, I believe in God, and another group of people who says, I don't, that is also a debate, a theological debate, a debate about religion. And what they were objecting to at Teen Challenge, again, was just being told that they had to go and sit for 270 hours and learn a religion that was not their own. And again, they had the track record to show that they knew what they were doing. So it's not, when you say medical treatment, it's not as if there were going to be people who were in physical agony and they were going to chase doctors away or anything like that. No. This was a difference in philosophy. It was a debate. And here you get to the basic question of, and this to me is a constitutional question as well as a question of equity. Should the government be putting its thumb on the scales when there's a theological debate? For example, in Catholic Charities right now, and for many years, there has been a theological debate. There's a debate about religion of the deed versus a more holistic religion of the deed plus religion of the word. Every time that this debate intensifies, the people who believe in religion of the deed say, well, whether or not you agree with us, we have to win this debate because the government won't allow you to win the debate. That's the government putting its thumb on the scales. And I don't think the federal government or state government or local government should be a theological arbiter like that, and essentially saying certain religions we consider to be legitimate and certain religions we consider to be beyond the pale. That's the essential problem right here. But how to fix it is a more difficult problem. And again, there are attempts, we're seeing the attempt right now to try to fix it in some way by being more equitable, by not having a line of distinction right here, essentially a wall of separation between government-approved religion and government-scorned religion, but trying to let all different religious groups in on this. And Pat Robertson is always provides a source of merriment, but my sense is that this is a land of liberty, and all religion should be involved in this. I'm not so worried about particular this or that. I'm much more worried actually about religions being excluded. But let me just say here to conclude, this is the essential problem. And we're finding that the process of trying to extend this so we don't have a wall of separation between approved and scorned religions really does not look like it's going to work. I think we've had a couple of months of experience of that already, and the divisiveness that Sam spoke about is very true. And what really scares me a lot is when people start playing racial cards in this. We don't need class against class, we don't need race against race, and we don't need religion against religion. And this is why I think the most encouraging proposals I've seen are the tax credit proposals. And let me just ask one question here to all of you right in this room. If you had, you were given $500 and you were told you could send it to any poverty-fighting agency of your choice, whether public, private, religious, secular, government, not government, how many of you would send that $500 to the federal government? I don't see anyone here. Well, okay. There's a brave soul over there. There are two. There are two that sent to the federal government. Okay, that's fine. How many of you know of some charity that you would send that $500 to? Okay. I mean, this is essentially what the tax credit proposal is all about. Allowing people to make those choices. So, yes, that you would be allowed to select that charity. That's exactly what the tax credit proposal essentially amounts to. Anyway.
Go ahead.
I want to respond to the response, and I do want to credit Professor Olasky for being, I think, of the lead proponents of charitable choice, the most inclusive, frankly, of all of them. I really have seen this very consistently in his comments. I don't believe he intends to shut anyone out, unlike others like DiIulio, who's running the program, President Bush, who thinks maybe this group shouldn't get money, maybe this group shouldn't get money, maybe this group shouldn't get money. And this concerns me greatly, too. But I feel that the paradigm that, our government is hostile to evangelical Christianity and a couple of other groups, and this idea that our government and our body of scientific knowledge and our culture are not only hostile to evangelical Christianity, but that these two worlds cannot be reconciled is a view that is troubling to me. For instance, with Teen Challenge, the group that did not want to sit through 270 hours, this is that they didn't want to have their counselors licensed. And you characterize that as 270 hours learning a religion that is not their own. Why is scientific knowledge about addiction treatment antithetical to evangelical Christianity? I don't understand that.
No, that I think is a mischaracterization of what I was saying. Microphone?
Pull it closer.
Oh. Yeah. Hello? There we go. No, that I think mischaracterizes what I was saying. It is not as if the model that Teen Challenge uses is an anti-scientific model. Science is experimenting. Science is trying things, examining the results, keeping very careful records. That's what Teen Challenge is doing. Now, they are proving scientifically to their satisfaction, not to mine yet. I think we need a lot more research on this. But they are showing that their model works. They are, in a sense, doing a scientific experiment on volunteers who come to them, as any anti-addiction group is doing a scientific experiment on volunteers who come to them. I think we have to keep very careful records and compare. If we were to find, over time, that the Teen Challenge people are accurate in saying that their program works much more effectively than the other model, then we'd have to say, let's look at that model and see if in some ways it is an unscientific model because it is not responding to the needs of the clients. It is not, science shows you, in essence, what works and what doesn't work. Faith is when you say it doesn't matter what the results are, we're still going to do things our way. That's not what Teen Challenge is doing. They're saying we want to very carefully examine our results, and we want to compare those results with the results of other programs.
Actually, the tone is a little more defiant than that. It's that we will not hire licensed counselors. We will not comply with regulations. One of the regulations that was dropped as part of President Bush's, then Governor Bush's initiative, was one that would keep groups from, like Teen Challenge, from admitting someone who required medical care from a physician to stabilize a physical or mental disorder. There used to be a regulation that those people who had some overriding physical or mental disorder should not be in exclusively non-medical faith-based treatment programs. This was overridden. So I think that the case with Teen Challenge and Victory Fellowship and these other groups actually was more of a contentious debate, because otherwise, why not just license your counselors?
One of the things that I think is interesting about the discussion of these institutions is, as you've heard, that the social science is really in a formative stage. about these. One of the things that we know is that there are some tremendously effective faith-based programs across the country. And this being a great and good country, there are also some pretty lousy faith-based social service programs across the country. And I think it's very dangerous to kind of paint with this broad brush, to walk out of something thinking that they're all good, they're all bad, they all have good results, they all have bad results. That's clearly not the case. Some of them have a record, some of them are beginning to develop a record, some of them have a bad record. As we look at them more closely, we need to look at them kind of as a case-by-case basis. While I have the mic, a couple of other quick points. Sure. One, I'm struck by Marvin's observation about hostility to religion in the United States today. And it's interesting. And I think it is a really important difference, not just between the two of us, but between how people approach this debate. Because when I look at the public square today, when I look at the role that religion plays in all aspects of American life, I see religion thriving. I see religious communities growing. I see people telling, well, what kind of measures do we have? People tell pollsters they believe in God, they go to church or synagogue, all of those kind of measures, and even the kind of types of religious life where I was talking about. I look and see an election in which we just had, of all things, an Orthodox Jewish candidate for Vice President of the United States who, let's just say, came very close, becoming the Vice President of the United States. That, to me, does not suggest a public square or an American community more broadly that's hostile to religion. In fact, almost the only thing that people knew about Senator Lieberman early on was he's an Orthodox Jew, and the religion was the organizing principle of his life. Third, and then I'll stop, about tax cuts. I think that the discussion about tax credits is a very promising avenue of discussion. It does begin to address a lot of the constitutional concerns, a lot of the policy concerns that flow from them. The concerns about government imprimatur on religion, concerns about discrimination, and I think it does begin to address them. The real challenge, and I know that Marvin would agree, is in making sure that those programs, that those funds flow to where the need is. That it doesn't do any good if all of you take your $500 and give it to programs that really aren't addressing the most pressing need. And we need to remember that the government is the program of last resort. The government programs have to take all comers. The government programs don't get to pick and choose their clientele. And tax credits, too, are tax expenditures, are in effect budget choices that we make. As we enter into this area, a massive tax cut coming its way to us, a shrinking amount of federal dollars to address a lot of these pressing social problems, we want to make sure, I think we all agree we want to make sure, that we find ways to target those funds to where the need is the greatest. And we haven't figured that part out yet.
Let maybe say something. Stephen Goldsmith, whom Professor Olasky mentioned earlier, the former mayor of Indianapolis, who was counselor to President Bush and Governor Bush in setting up these things, has said himself that we really don't have good data to say that faith-based organizations do a better job than secular organizations. That appears to be the case. You can point out anecdotally that there are some very good ones, and no one denies that. Tony Campolo, who was here last month over dinner, said ahead of time, and we said we won't talk about faith-based organizations that night, but he said, I run a faith-based organization and we get some government money. And Gene Rivers in Boston runs a successful faith-based organization. I go around the country and check on these, and it seems to me like that 95% of them are not doing are not effective. Mark Chavez, a sociologist at the University of Arizona, recently did a survey of 1,200 churches. He found that about half of these were engaged in some kind of social service activity, mostly African American and liberal Protestant churches, but that a very high percentage of these were short-term, short-range kinds of things, sending a few people to a food line, food bank, or some things like that, and that the congregations on average were giving 2 to 4% of their budgets for these kinds of initiatives. I think that it's important, as everyone here has noted, that it's important to make sure that that whether it's tax credits, and I agree, that seems like that unravels some of the knots, perhaps, depending on how it's worked out, but that it is a serious kind of mistake, I think, to believe that faith-based organizations can ever become a major part of we'll have the expertise, we'll have the personnel, we'll be able to have the organization based on what we see about us, and has been pointed out with respect to the small number of children's homes that had the alternative accreditation, that over the last 4 years, and it may simply be because, or 5 years, because the charitable choice provision has not been given that much publicity, but that a relatively small number of organizations have come forward to avail themselves of it, and in part because of the apprehension about what regulation might mean. So there are a number of issues here. We try to quit these in 2 hours, and I suppose we will do that. We don't want people to say, "Well, I don't want to get caught here in a marathon." I want to thank those of you who have come regularly to these, and of course those of you who are coming for the first time. I'll let you know that this again through Mr. Siobhan's graciousness, the series will continue in the fall. We will have, because the fall semester is a little more squatty, we're going to have two programs in the fall. They're not completely set, but we're working on them. One of these will have to do with various issues relating to religion and education. Another will have to do particularly with science and religion, and that I'll be joined by Professor Neil Lane, who is a university professor here and former director of the National Science Foundation, and also the President Clinton's science advisor. Now is back at Rice. We're going to be meeting on that, and then shortly after the first of the year, probably in early February, we're planning to have a program dealing with the influence of American Christian and particularly conservative Christian views on Arab-Israeli problems in the Middle East, which should be a quite interesting program. So I want you to, can't put them on your calendar yet, but we'll keep you informed about that. Again, thank Mr. Siobhan, thank all of you for coming. Thank our panelists, Sam Smoot, Mark Palavin, and Marvin Olasky, and wish you a very pleasant evening.
Right now, Ernie Banks used to say, let's play too.